Okay, 2 lectures on John Locke, one of the greatest English philosophers of the mind. Note his dates, 1632 to 1704, which means, if you remember the dates of Thomas Hobbes, he's the next generation to Thomas Hobbes, and this is significant. And in many ways, much of his writing, certainly the writing on politics and the writing about his writings about the way the mind works, were a reaction against Hobbes, the gloomy sage of Monmouth. He wanted to propose a more rational, a more positive view of human nature, rather than the gloomy, irrational view of Thomas Hobbes. And in this lecture, and probably the one after, I'll be discussing why these differences between Hobbes's view of how the mind works and Locke's view, why these aren't just factual differences. And I'll be talking in this lecture particularly Locke's famous arguments against what's called innate ideas, instinctual ideas. Oh, I've got the list to pass around. Sorry. Now, let me start with what the person who Locke was arguing against, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was the problem for Locke's generation, because Hobbes had come to these rather distressing conclusions that humans weren't to be trusted, we were all selfish, we needed firm authority, and everyone felt there's something wrong here. Are we as bad as and untrustworthy as Hobbes says? But if we're not, where's the fault in Hobbes's argument? Look what he's done. He's looked at the human mind. He has that image of perception, the object hitting the eye, to the brain, to the heart, to action. It all seems so logical. It all seems so correct. Where's the error? And there was a political error. Monarchists, and Hobbes was a monarchist. They distrusted Hobbes's philosophy, because he wasn't saying we need a king because God has ordained that kings should rule over us, as the monarchists like to believe. But Hobbes seemed to have reduced it to, well, rather sordid matters. He was saying we need a king because kings are useful. Taken the glitter out of things. And parliamentarians, on the other side, distrusted his view, because Hobbes was saying we can't. It's the other way round, I think. Thomas Hobbes was a great geometer. He would have solved that problem immediately. Sorry. Parliamentarians distrusted Hobbes, because Hobbes was saying people need a powerful ruler to control them. They can't control themselves. And parliamentarians were saying, yes, we can. And there's this general feeling there's an error somewhere in Hobbes. Just doesn't seem right. But where was it? And Locke didn't say, oh, there's this error, there's this argument Hobbes uses which is just wrong. What he does is quite interesting. He starts from the beginning how the mind works, and then builds up a different picture of the mind, stressing thoughtfulness, rationality, how we can get the truth. And this is interesting because he's not directly refuting Hobbes and saying, oh, there's the error of Hobbes, here's the finding which will disprove Hobbes. He's going about it in the same way, starting from scratch, but building up a different image of the way the mind works and of human nature. And why is this interesting? Well, why do I find it interesting? I shouldn't project my interest all onto you. Because in some way, it prefigures the way which psychological theories would in the future rise and fall. And they don't rise and fall like Popper said. You have a theory, you test it, and then empirically you refute it. And then you need a new theory. And in psychology, it often doesn't work like that. One theory approach is not actually empirically refuted. It's just they rise and fall and they have different images of humans and what we do. And in some ways, Locke and Hobbes are like an early version of the debate between behaviourism and cognitive psychology in the 20th century. Although I make the parallel with provisos. Hobbes wasn't a behaviourist, although in some ways his theory looks like behaviourism. But what happened in the last century, behaviourism in the early years, well, in the 1930s to the 1950s, was dominant in psychology. And then in the 1970s, it seemed suddenly old-fashioned and replaced by cognitive psychology, which has maintained its position of dominance since then. And cognitive psychology didn't take over because there was a crucial experiment. And a cognitive psychologist didn't say, look, I've done this experiment and this shows behaviourism is wrong. It wasn't refuted in a Popperian sense. There was no decisive experiment. Or it wasn't a matter of moving to experimental psychology, for both were experimental. It was just a feeling that behaviourism had a restrictive view of the person. Behaviourists, and here's the similarity with Hobbes, behaviourists seem to think that people were just determined by what they like, which they approached, and what they didn't like, which they avoided. A simple view that there's almost humans were just machines which approach and avoid, want pleasure and avoid pain, and so on. And Locke, like the cognitive psychologist, said, no, it's more complicated than that. We have minds, we think, and our thoughts are more complicated than just trying to get pleasure and avoid pain. And the cognitive psychologists were looking at phenomena which the behaviourists didn't look at. But behaviourism, once cognitive psychology rose, it wasn't proved wrong, it just seemed old-fashioned and a bit narrow. And cognitivists were finding new topics. How we construct representations of reality from perception, how the mind works, how we think. What are the images which we store in the memory in order to enable us to understand the world as we experience it? All this the behaviourists ignored. And in some ways, this is exactly what Locke was doing in trying to create an alternative account of the way humans think and act from Hobbes. He was looking at the bits and pieces in the mind which Hobbes really didn't pay much attention to. And he was, in so doing, he was a foretaste of this debate which would reoccur in the 20th century, and which still goes on now. That Hobbes was like the behaviourists with a limited view of humans, just pleasure or pain. And what we say is good is what brings us pleasure, what we say is evil is just what brings us pain, what we don't like. Behaviourists would say something similar. Hobbes wasn't a behaviourist and didn't say, oh, don't look in the mind, which the behaviourists would only look at behaviour. Hobbes looked in the mind and came to this conclusion. And Locke was like the father, and he has been called the father of modern cognitive psychology, believing that humans are capable of much more than just approach and avoidance, liking and disliking. They're capable of science, of complicated thinking. We're capable of knowledge, knowing the world. And to show this, he looks in great detail, exhaustive detail, at the way we acquire knowledge and how our minds work, where our ideas come from. Topics which Hobbes either ignored or dealt with very, very briefly. Because Hobbes was on his way to saying, oh, aren't humans awful? You just can't trust them. Locke is on his way to saying, the mind is capable of such important knowledge if only we use it right. And it's not a matter of refuting Hobbes and saying, look, here's a theory, here's an experiment, and we show dear old Thomas had got it wrong. Difficult to say Hobbes is empirically wrong, or the behaviourists are empirically wrong. See, Hobbes says we're all very selfish. You could say, all you need to do is provide an example of someone being selfless, someone devoting their lives to charity. Doesn't work, because the Hobbesian, the cynic, can say, they only do that because collecting money for charity gives them their pleasure. They get pleasure out of thinking, what a wonderful person I am. It's almost like it's so difficult to refute a psychological theory. You can always find a reason why that original theory was right. But what you do, you change the agenda, you change the topic. You say, well, look at this, not that. Well, look at the intricacy of the mind, not just how we like things or dislike things. And this change is different from the change between, say, Newton and Einstein, where a theory was shown to make particular predictions, which were then shown to be empirically invalid. As if psychology doesn't work in the way which Popper thought a proper science should work. Well, let's go into Locke. And the first thing to grasp is to take Locke as a historical figure. He's the next generation on from Hobbes, which means he was a young man during the Civil War, because the Civil War was the big event of the 17th century. Huge event, at least a big event for anyone living in Britain in the 17th century. It scarred everyone. And he was on the other side. Hobbes was the royalist, supporting the king for his own particular reasons. But Locke grew up in the West Country, in Somerset, miles and miles away from London. Several days' journey to London. He had a Protestant background. His parents were Protestant. They supported the parliamentary cause, but they weren't extreme Protestants. But they distrusted Catholics and they distrusted kings. Now, Locke would have remained a local figure, almost certainly. Grew up in rural Somerset, and he might have become a gentleman in rural Somerset, not an aristocrat, but in the middle class, like his father, but for the Civil War. Civil wars are awful things, but they can sometimes, because they disrupt the order, provide opportunities for those who otherwise wouldn't have opportunities. And what happened is Locke's father supported the local MP, supported him in many different ways. He risked his life for the local MP. And the local MP paid back the support by paying for the education of the young John Locke. And it meant that John Locke, for fortuitous reasons, reasons which would not have occurred had there not been the Civil War, was able to go to a very good school in London. He was sent away to London, and then his education to Oxford was paid for. And it did mean that during the Republic, 1649 to 1660, after the execution of Charles I, when Hobbes was in exile, although he came back for a while, earlier than the end of the Republic. I've got that slightly wrong there. I exaggerated. Locke was in England, growing up. But Locke really grew up in the time and the place which was dangerous for Hobbes. And he trained as a doctor at Oxford, and he witnessed at first hand, while he was at Oxford, the growth of science, and he was drawn to science. Although he had a classical education, no science at school, suddenly his world was opened. Training as a doctor in the 17th century was slightly different than training as a doctor today. Much of the training was not based on the science of anatomy and physiology. A lot of it was also based on classical education, looking and seeing what classical figures like the ancient Greek Aristotle or the classical Roman doctor Galen said how to treat patients. They were treated as the authorities, these classical figures. Locke actually didn't finish his exams and never passed to get a degree in medicine, but in those less rigorous times, and in some respects, in just one or two little respects, more enlightened times, that didn't stop it, didn't prevent this great thinker from practicing as a doctor and helping people. He didn't actually need the certificate. Now, Locke was a great admirer of the new science and the new knowledge. And he distrusted the ancient authorities. He said, well, if you're going to cure people, if you're going to help people with their medical problems, don't just look up in a book and see what Aristotle said or Galen said. They lived well over 1,000 years ago. Surely we know more now. And he followed the path of what's popularly known as the empirics. The doctors who said, let's look and see what happens. Let's look at the evidence. Let's try out different medicines and see which works. Trust what you see, what you can observe, not what you've been told by ancient authorities. Well, you could come back and say, well, no, it can't be that simple. I mean, Aristotle could see, Galen could see, they were great minds, and what? Surely we should learn what the greatest people can see. Well, why not trust them? And there was a simple reply to that, which you may not have occurred to you. I'll ask you, why do you think a doctor or an anatomist in the mid-17th century could see more than Galen or Aristotle? What had changed? Anyone? It's a simple answer. It's a huge answer in science. The technology had changed. By the mid-17th century, doctors, scientists had microscopes. And because of the technology of lens grinding, the human eye could see things in the mid-17th century which the great authorities couldn't see. This was vital for the discovery of the circulation of the blood, which occurred early in the 17th century. William Harvey, by means of microscopes, could see something which biologists and anatomists had never been able to see before. In these vessels which contain blood, which we all have, the big ones and the small ones, the big ones are the arteries, and the small ones are the veins. And in the veins, if you look with a microscope, and you can't see with your eye, if you look at the veins of a chicken or of a dead human, you'll see that in the veins, the little ones, there are valves. And what do the valves do? They prevent our blood just falling down when we stand up. It enables the blood to come back up from the foot, from the arm, back to the heart. And unless you could see the valves, in these, in only the small ones, and they're not needed in the big ones, because they whoosh, the blood whooshes through from the heart, you wouldn't be able to formulate this theory of the circulation of the blood. And the basis of Locke's argument was, we can know the world if we use our eyes, if we base knowledge on perception. Well, in the 16th century, the Republic was over. Parliament called for Charles II to come back and to be king. And in what's called the Restoration period, known for its rather bawdy plays and novels, because Charles II very much was a man of pleasure. It also was a time of the growth of science, physics with Newton, chemistry with Boyle, and the foundation in these years of the Royal Society to bring scientists together to talk about science. And Locke was an early member from Oxford, a young man from Oxford, still at Oxford, and his life changed and by another fortuitous event. When he was still at Oxford, and he wasn't teaching medicine, he hadn't passed his exams. He was teaching rhetoric, teaching grammar, and he had a chance meeting with the Earl of Shaftesbury. He was a very small man, just over 5 foot, with a hunchback, needed continual medical treatment. And he was travelling round Oxford, and his normal doctor couldn't treat him, and this young man was recommended and came out and treated him, and they got on well together and chatted about the same general philosophy, and Shaftesbury was struck with Locke. Now, who was Shaftesbury? Shaftesbury was one of the most important politicians of the time. Someone whom other politicians feared, respected, and if they knew what was good for them, didn't trust. He'd been a former Republican. In the Civil War, he'd supported Cromwell's side. But now he was a supporter of monarchy. He had a nose for where the wind was blowing, which way it was going. He had actually been one of the signatories on the order to execute Charles I. And now here he was, Charles II was allowing him to serve him. During the last days of the Republic, Shaftesbury realised that the Republic was not going to last, that it was losing its grip on power. Smart man, smart man. He contacted Charles II. He allied himself to the monarch, so that when the monarch came back, there was one of the men who had killed his father, but there ready to serve him. And Charles II, the pragmatist, said, yeah, okay, yeah, this man is going to be useful. And Shaftesbury, after that meeting with Locke, appointed Locke as his personal advisor. He was going to pay Locke to be his political, personal advisor was a political advisor. And Shaftesbury he was Lord High Chancellor, one of the most important political offices in the country at that time. He was right in the centre of things. This old Republican, he shouldn't have been, but he was. And Locke, on his coattails, came into government as President of the Board of Trade. While Locke was President of the Board of Trade, he also had a position which meant he linked up with Newton, Isaac Newton, who was head of a mint. He was working on his great book, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is the book where he outlines his view of the mind. It's a real example of how intellectual greatness does not necessarily mean you keep yourself apart from the world of politics. And there you might think, Charles II on the throne, Locke in government, allied to working for Shaftesbury, who was one of the big wheels in the government, but things were working out. But Shaftesbury was almost addicted to political intrigue. He couldn't let things stay as they were. And deep down, the old Republican distrusted Charles II, and distrusted him for good reason. He thought that Charles II was favourable to Catholicism, and that he was paving the way for his brother to succeed him, and his brother was a practising Catholic. And so the Protestants feared, Protestants like Shaftesbury, feared what was happening politically. And there were a lot of plots against Charles II. These were turbulent times. And Shaftesbury may or may not have been involved in the plots. He probably was, but in a very distant way. But he was prosecuted for treason. And prosecuted for treason is a serious prosecution. If found guilty, his head would be severed from his body. Amazingly, the jury found him, despite the evidence, found him not guilty. But Shaftesbury knew his time was up. He had to flee to the continent. He knew that he'd be arrested again, and maybe the next jury wouldn't find him guilty. And Locke knew that he was associated with Shaftesbury, that he wouldn't escape. If Shaftesbury were executed, Locke would be the next one. And so Locke followed Shaftesbury into exile. This sort of thing doesn't tend to happen to modern cognitive psychologists, but it did to Locke. And there it would have remained, as if Shaftesbury, as he got older, had backed the wrong political horse and made a mess of things just when he seemed to have come back from disaster. And Shaftesbury died in exile. Locke remained alive, but the old plotter, the old devious man, was actually proved to be right. Charles II died, James II came to the throne, and clearly he had Catholic sympathies. And clearly this was going to upset a country which had moved towards Protestantism. And then the most amazing event occurred, which is crucial in the development of British political history. Far more important in terms of its outcome than the Civil War had been. That in 1688, the Glorious Revolution occurred. This is what is known as the Glorious Revolution, because it was bloodless. Parliament passed a bill saying that James II should no longer be King of England and Scotland, because he was James VII of Scotland as well. And the Parliament would choose a new king. Actually, it chose a king and a queen. It chose William of Orange, a Dutchman, and his wife Mary, who was an Englishwoman. And here was, if ever there was a refutation of Hobbes, it was in this act, at least if it would work. Because instead of the people needing a king to control them, the people through Parliament, and it should be said, this is only a small part of the people. There wasn't universal suffrage, only a small number of people could vote. But nevertheless, it set a precedent that people could say, we will choose our leaders. And if the leaders do not fulfil what we want them to fulfil, we will send them packing. We won't cut off their heads, we'll just say, go away. We don't want you, we're bringing in another leader. So here's the event, which for all time in British history afterwards established a precedent that kings rule, or queens rule, monarchs rule, with the permission of Parliament. And this is what Locke and Shaftesbury had been arguing for. And Locke had written several pamphlets arguing this, but he hadn't published them under his own name. In fact, some of them he hadn't published at all. Too dangerous. And there, once the new king had been established, Parliament had brought in a new king from Holland, a Protestant king. There comes Locke, crossing the Channel, with a trunk full of his clothes, and much more importantly, a trunk full of his manuscripts, which he'd been writing for years, including the essay concerning human understanding, and political essays. These essays which he'd been writing for 20, 30 years, which was too dangerous to publish. And indeed, some of the political essays, when he came back to England, he still published them anonymously, because he still feared that if he were identified as the author, he might face trial and possibly execution. But the essay concerning human understanding, which was published 2 years after the Glorious Revolution, he published under his own name. There it says on the title page, John Locke, Gentleman. He was a bit sensitive about his upbringing, but he wasn't out of the top drawer. And there on his big book, he wanted the world to know he was a gentleman. And it comprises 4 sections of what he called 4 books. And when he says it's 4 books, book 1, book 2, these didn't mean actual separate volumes. Actually, it was published when it was first published in 4 separate volumes, but the volumes didn't correspond to the books. The books was just a way of grouping the chapters. Do you understand that? I'll say that again if it's a bit complicated. Books has 2 meanings. One, an aggregation of chapters or a division within a book, and a book also means a physical object. So the division of Locke's human essay concerning human understanding comprises these 4 sections, which he called books. And although it was published in 4 different books, the books themselves didn't parallel the division in terms of books. Oh God, it doesn't matter! It's a sort of little bibliographical detail which nerds like me enjoy. The first 2 books, I don't mean physical books, I mean subsections, sections, deal with the issue of where our knowledge of the world comes from, and in essence he's giving a cognitive psychological account. And the second 2 books really are applied cognitive psychology. It's not where does our knowledge come from, but how we should reason, how we should use our minds, and how we should avoid errors of reasoning. Because at the root, Locke was saying errors come, superstitions, prejudices come from faulty reasoning which is avoidable. And it wasn't Hobbes's vision that our errors come from faulty emotions and a faulty emotional nature which is unavoidable because we're just born with it. We don't choose to act selfishly, we just do. Locke was saying, no. Our minds can save us if we know how to think. Now, the first book of the essay, which is a very short book, asks the question, where do our ideas come from? Now, so there's no confusion, and it's easy to confuse, but Locke uses the word idea in a very, very wide sense. An idea can refer to, well, you have a good idea. Oh, I've got a good idea. I'm going to do this for my project. Or I've got an idea that this bit of machinery works like this. And an idea can be a complicated thought, or it can be a preference which you can express in words. My idea about this person is not to be trusted. But Locke uses the term idea to describe whatsoever is the object of understanding when a man thinks, and like all writers of his day, he used man as person. He certainly didn't believe that women can't think. In fact, he never married. But the nearest he got to having an affair, which he almost certainly didn't have, was with a woman philosopher, Damaris Cudworth, whose intellect he respected enormously. Now, what he uses the word idea is rather like modern cognitive psychologists use cognitions or mental representations. It's a general term for whatever's in the mind and whatever has content in the mind. So an idea could be a perceptual representation. For instance, if I look at you, pardon me, I shall stare at you and I have an idea of you in my mind. It doesn't mean I have beliefs about who you are or what you might do. I have an idea in Locke's terms which is a representation of yourself. So if we wanted to retranslate our Locke into modern terms, his question is, what is the origin of our cognitions? Where do our cognitive entities come from? Perceptual entities, beliefs, and so on. And I think Locke, towards the after the book was published, regretted using the word idea because it could be confused as meaning something rather complicated. But he used it as an overall term. And then his discussion of the origins of ideas is absolutely brilliant. And in the case of psychology, or works about human nature, I will say again and again that the most brilliant works are often the most simplest. There's often a tendency in modern psychology to complicate things, to add variable after variable after variable, draw out these complicated theories of arrows going into other arrows and whatever. But the real brilliant minds think simply. The origins of our ideas, Locke said, well, two possible origins. Either we're born with some ideas, they are innate, they're in ourselves, or they come from outside the mind. If they're not within us, they come from without. And if they come from without, they must come via perception. We hear, what we feel, what we touch, and above all, what we see. And in so doing, Locke was posing the issue, which these are the terms he used, the terms used in the 19th century, a question of nature and nurture. And it's the big question of so much later psychology. How much of our behaviour, our thoughts, our reactions, how much of this is innate, nature, and how much is learnt, nurture? How much is instinct, and how much is learnt from other people? And Locke was an early advocate of nature. We learn. That's where our ideas come from. And Hobbes, of course, had been thinking about humans in terms of their innate properties. Humans are selfish. They don't learn to be selfish, they just are selfish. That is our nature, instinctual nature. Now let's have a look at that first book, The Attack on the Concept of Innate Ideas. And the doctrine of innate ideas is that we are born with ideas, with knowledge, with entities, as it were, contents in our mind. Now, there were those who supported innate ideas when Locke was writing, and one of their arguments was, if you see a belief which is universal, that is a sign that that belief may be innate. Locke said, that's a weak argument. Even if a belief is universal, that doesn't mean it's innate. And one of the arguments which those who believed in innate ideas was that wherever you go, people believe in God. The idea of God is innate, and this shows that God, who created us with a predisposition to believe in God. But Locke said, no, even if all adults believed in God, and Locke, well, a couple of reasons, that wouldn't necessarily mean that the idea of God is innate. And he says, look at newborn young children. The young child comes into this world without an idea of God. Babies don't have beliefs in God. The belief in God comes later, it's taught. And then Locke says, but that's all predicated on the idea that the belief of God is universal, but actually it's not universal. And Locke, as a great believer in empiricism, read a lot of what now we would call anthropology, tales of Europeans who'd gone around the world and came back and reported on societies which were very different from European societies. And some came back and said, I've met with a group of people, a society which has no concept of God. And Locke was not surprised. Locke also knew there were individuals in Western society who didn't believe in God. Not that they could trumpet it widely. I mean, Locke would have suspected, as many did, that Hobbes didn't believe in God. Okay, so there he says that no empirical knowledge is innate. But what of non-empirical? What of mathematical knowledge? Like the sum that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And that is universally true. Even if you discover a society which knows no mathematics, has no words for numbers, nevertheless a mathematician will say that doesn't affect the truth of the proposition 2 plus 2 equals 4. It just means some people haven't understood it. And what sort of knowledge is 2 plus 2 equals 4? It's not empirical knowledge. It seems a universal knowledge. Is it innate? And Locke said, no, of course it's not innate. He takes the empirical view and says, look at the newborn child. Does the newborn child know 2 plus 2 equals 4? No, it has to be taught. The baby, the infant, can't do mathematics. In order to do mathematics, you have to acquire a range of skills in different stages. You have to learn how to count. Count without an understanding sometimes of number. You have to learn the names of numbers. You have to be taught. You know, if you see 2 horses, oh, there's 2 horses. You have to, and you have to associate the word 2 with 2 horses, 2 sheep, 2 people, and so on, 2 knives, and whatever. And when Locke argues like this, he argues like a modern developmental psychologist. Look and see how we acquire our complicated ideas, like mathematical ideas. He says we acquire them in stages. I won't deal in this lecture where Locke might have got his knowledge of how children think from. It certainly wasn't from his own children because he didn't have any. He lived a solitary life, right, like Hobbes. But although he claimed at the start of his book, like Hobbes did, I shall just be examining my own mind because you can't examine someone else's mind, he wasn't. He was observing what people do, in this case what a child does, can and can't do. So Locke said, the conclusion of this first book, there are no innate ideas. We don't come into the world with ideas. At birth, the mind is empty. Tabula rasa is the term often used to describe Locke's idea of what the mind is like at birth. It's a Latin term meaning empty slate, blank slate. And he didn't actually, although the phrase is attributed to him, he didn't actually use it in the essay. He said, the mind is like white paper, void of all characters, without any ideas. It's like a blank slate. Actually, in an early draft, which we have, where it's full of scribbles out and crossing out, he does use tabula rasa, and then he crosses it out and replaces the phrase by blank slate. There's actually a reason. I can't resist telling little stories and whatever, going off on tangents when it comes to history. Prior to the 16th century, practically all European intellectuals wrote their big books in Latin. Latin was the universal language of educated Europeans. In the 17th century, things started to change, and great figures started writing works in their own language. Hobbes was a mixture. His work on human nature, he wrote in Latin. Some of his other later works, he wrote in English. Locke is the first great English philosopher to write almost entirely in English. He could write in Latin, he was taught to write in Latin, but he preferred to use English. It seemed more modern. And that's why he didn't use a Latin phrase. He wasn't going to give any ground to the old classicists, as if this was it's better to use, or more precise to use a Latin term. So he says, the mind is empty at birth. And that brings the question, ideas come into the mind after birth. How? How do they come? Another question, why was Locke's attack on the innate ideas not just important at the time, but so controversial that he resisted publishing it until he felt politically secure? And what is wrong with the way that Locke formulated the question of, is an idea either innate or it's acquired through the senses? What's wrong with that, at least in terms of modern cognitive psychology? Three very important questions, which I hope you all find very, very interesting, because I'm not going to answer them just now. I'm going to have a break, and I hope that you are so struck with these questions that you will be around at 5 minutes' time when I shall start giving answers to them. I shall start at 11 prompt. In part 2, this is part 2, the second lecture of one long lecture, or second book of one big book. No, I'm not going. I'm going to be talking about John Locke and his theory of knowledge, and his argument how we and why we construct knowledge from perception, and why his approach is different from Hobbes, and that Locke believed, and I shall go into the reasons why he believed this, that true perception, accurate perception was possible. And also, as I go through the lecture, I'll be suggesting why Locke may have been oversimplifying things to say the mind is empty at birth. And I'll be talking about the implications of Locke's psychology. For those who've just come in, you haven't missed anything, this is just the outline of what I shall be doing in this session. And basically, I shall start off by outlining the second book of the essay concerning human understanding. Okay, Locke has started in that first book saying knowledge is either innate or it's acquired, and he's given reasons why it can't be innate. Newborn children don't come in saying, oh, 2 + 2 = 4. So that must be acquired. How? How do we acquire knowledge? And Locke says it must be through the senses. Whatever is not innate in the brain must come through the sense, come into the brain, and it must come into the brain through the senses. So far, so good. And he's proposing a basic cognitive model. We receive, which is in many ways similar to Hobbes, we receive images from the outside world through our senses to the brain. And most notably, he thinks of visual perception, but it still works for auditory perception, for touch, and so on. It's a basic cognitive model. Something out there comes to our senses and then comes to our brain. It's similar to Hobbes, but less physiological. Right at the start of the essay, Locke says, I'm not interested in the physiology. Very interesting. This is the doctor, the man who knows physiology, says, I'm not interested in physiology. Hobbes was much more interested in some ways. And so Locke isn't interested in the physiology of perception, the nerves between the eye and the brain. In fact, in those days, people knew there were, scientists knew there were nerves, but didn't know how the nerves worked. There were years off thinking that there was an electrical pulse. They didn't even know about electricity in these days. I mean, he says, I'm not interested. He's building up a cognitive model, not that he uses the word cognitive. He's wanting to see how the mind works, how we take things from perception and build up ideas, complicated ideas. And here's the big difference with Hobbes. Locke is proposing what we could call a rational perception. And Hobbes, if you remember rightly, his model of perception, outside world, comes to the eye, goes to the brain, and then from a brain, not to the arms or legs, but to the heart, and then to the arms or legs or whatever part of the body is affected. And to approach or avoid as if the heart, which he believed was the seat of emotions, not a pumping blood round, but the heart determines what we do next. It's as if it's wired in that we're emotional beings. Locke bypasses the heart, really. Images from the world to the senses, to the brain, to knowledge. And that's what he's interested in. The heart can get in the way. And if we keep the heart out of it, we can get knowledge. We can get science. We can know the world. And basically, we create or construct knowledge from what we see. The visual sense dominates in Locke. You'd also say from what we hear. Okay, are you all with that? Yeah? We could say, well, who's right? Hobbes or Locke? We're complicated beings. Both are right. Perception can affect feeling. You can see something and be overcome by beauty. The sunset, the beauty of a face. You can hear a song which moves you to tears. You can smell an odour which fills you with disgust, and so on. All that can happen. And also, perception can give rise to knowledge. And Harvey and other anatomists saw the veins with their valves and saw no valves in the slightly larger arteries. That led them to the knowledge that maybe blood doesn't just stay there, it moves around. And what Hobbes and Locke were doing were emphasising different things about humans. Locke, the old gloomy miserabilist, was emphasising really what we don't do very well. Locke, looking to the future, looking and thinking the world can be better, was looking to how we know the world. But if we can only build a world on knowledge, not on prejudice and superstition, we can create a better world. Hobbes distrusting human reactions as selfish, as if all we're doing is trying to gain personal pleasure and avoid pain. And Locke, we can use our minds, if only we knew how, to build better worlds, more reasonable worlds, and it would all be based on knowledge. The more knowledge we have, the better we are as people and as a species. So, to say this, Locke has to say what differentiates knowledge from prejudice or superstition or error. If you believe in knowledge, you've got to say what it is. You can't just say, oh, I think we can know things. The philosopher has to say, well, what is knowledge? And basically, Locke says knowledge are ideas which correspond to the world, to what is actually going on out there. Like he thought that Newton's theories corresponded to the physical world and how it operated, that the law of gravity corresponded to what was actually occurring in the world, the physical world. Isaac Newton was an awkward bugger. He brilliant, one of the most brilliant minds to come out of the East Midlands, the most brilliant mind probably to come out of the East Midlands. Another bachelor. And he seemed, nowadays we might classify him as borderline Asperger's. But actually Locke seemed to have got on with him well. Locke was probably about the only person who Newton could talk with and understand and so on. So it's rather nice thinking of these two rather prickly souls meeting. Now, Locke believed that knowledge was possible. And he believed that figures like Newton and Robert Boyle, the chemist, were creating this knowledge of the world, that their ideas, their theories, corresponded to the structure of the world itself. Now, how did they do this? It all depended on producing knowledge from perception. But you observe, and you build your ideas up from what can be observed, and your ideas should always match the observable world. Now, here is an assumption. And it's important, if people don't get this premise, I'll go over it again. But it's quite simple, and as I say, brilliance is often simplicity. If you say knowledge is based on perception, and it is possible to have knowledge, true knowledge, then it must be possible to have a true perception of the world. But knowledge is based on perception means that your perception of the world can be accurate. If anyone said, oh, perception is just subjective, and knowledge is based on perception, you come to the conclusion that objective knowledge is not possible. Does anyone want me to go over that premise, which lies at the assumption, at the root of Locke's psychological vision. You're happy with it? I'm not saying you're happy that you believe it necessarily, but this is the argument, the simple argument there, and why Locke's theory of perception is so important, not just for later psychology, but so important for his philosophy or his theory of the way the mind works. Because it's based on the assumption that we can see the world as the world really is, that we don't have minds which distort the world. So this is the fundamental assumption of Locke's theory of perception. We can see the world as it actually is. Our perceptions can be objective representations of the world. Look at me, look at me. All of you look at me. You've all got, if you're all looking at me, you've all got an image of me in your minds, in your brains. We don't know what your brains are doing, but somehow you can see things. Now, that image in your brains, does it reflect your individual personalities, your individual positions? Or is that image of me as I actually am? Now, Locke is saying that image of me which you have, so long as you're looking and not allowing other thoughts to get in the way, is as I actually am. This is me you are seeing. But there's a problem, is it? How can we know it? And how do I know that when you're looking at me, you're seeing exactly the same image as you who's looking at me? How do we compare them? Right? Or is knowledge subjective? Locke is saying it's objective, and that perception is the first step to knowledge. That's a quote from Locke. Two big assumptions here. And if any of you are getting lost, I'll happily go over this, because this is at the root of Locke. First of all, Locke uses the term simple, but we can have simple and clear perceptions which reflect things in the world. We have simple ideas, and Locke said we can trust the simple ideas. We receive basic units of information. That's a modern phrase, not one Locke would have used. And our perceptions of these simple ideas, say the whiteness there, or that greyness, my hand, reflect the external world, my hand as it actually is, and not your ideas or your own mind. Our simple ideas are all real, all agree to the reality of things. Comes from the second bit. And as a corollary of this, he then describes perception in a way which practically no modern perceptual psychologist would agree with, that perception is essentially a passive process. The reality of the world intrudes on us. We passively there just open our eyes and the world comes in. In the reception of simple ideas, the understanding is for the most part passive. You just receive. In this part, the understanding is merely passive. When this is going on, getting the information, the understanding, the way our minds work, is passive. For the objects of our senses do, many of them, obtrude their particular ideas upon our minds, whether we will or it or no. It just happens. We can't really close in, but we hear a sound. It just intrudes on us. We see something. We smell something. We haven't chosen to. It's just there. The world coming into us and we passively receiving the world. Okay, have I got you all there? Yep. And you can understand where Locke is going and why he's saying perception must be passive. It's because it's the basis of an empirical view of the world. Because he's wanting to argue it's possible to have objective, not subjective knowledge. Which means, at the root of this process of knowledge, our senses bring us the world as it actually is. Not the world according to our minds or our interpretations of the world, but the world as it actually is. There you look at me, and there you see me as I am actually there. It is not a trick of your imagination that I am tonsorially challenged and have a big gleaming bald spot. There it is, in all its objective lack of glory. But why? Then the question is of error. Why do we have so many untruths, so many errors? Where have they come from? If our minds see the world as it actually is, why is it? Where's the error all come from? And Locke says it's not because our senses are inaccurate. They're accurate. We're passive. We're not doing anything to them at that stage of reception. But it happens later on because this is using the modern term process. Locke didn't use the word process, but it's we process its information. And there, the way we use the information which our senses give us, we can use it for good or for ill. We can use it to create knowledge or superstition. But how does this happen? In Locke's model, perception is just the start. This is where it all comes from. It comes from our senses. We receive the information passively. We're walking around, sights, sounds, smells, whatever, are sayings. And then we start actively doing things with the sensations which we've received. And Locke uses, it's an unfortunate term, it has to be understood metaphorically. We reflect, or at least our minds reflect on the information that comes from our senses. And in this way, we create meaning. We put things together. We construct from a sense of white, a sense of black, white, black. We construct the words, we give them meaning. It's much more basic than this. It starts really early in the perceptual process. We judge an image to be similar or different to other images. This is the basis of recognition. Now, in that first lecture, I embarrassed you by looking at your face. Okay? I'm doing the same. Now, how do I know? But this is the same face, but you're the same person. Or have I made a mistake? Did I speak to you? No, I didn't. Somehow, automatically, my mind must be comparing the image I'm receiving now of your face with that image which I saw half an hour ago, which somehow must be stored somewhere in my brain. And that's what Locke means by reflecting. You take an image and you compare it to another image. This is how we can recognise faces. And then, supposing what I'm doing, and if you forgive me, in looking at you, And I'm comparing, not consciously, but it's going on automatically, the image of your face with the image I remember. That means there's two images in my mind, and I must distinguish between the present image, which is I'm pointing there, and that image in my mind. But I must reflect on that image in my mind and say, now that's a past image. But constantly for our minds to work, we must be doing this judging of what is present and what is past. And we combine images, we create images of complex things. Take it when I was looking at your face, or when you look at any face. What part of the face are you looking at? Is it the eyes? Is it the nose? The chin? Well, to recognise a face, it's all these things. But to recognise a face, you've got to put together the image of the eye, the image of the ears, the image of the nose, and so on. And sometimes we put together images of one thing and another. You who've been looking at me will recognise my face, and then you may associate this face with certain hand gestures I make when I lecture, of which you'll be more aware of than I am. And you will associate the image of a hand gesture with the image of a face and the top of the head. And Locke introduces a term then which is going to be really crucial in the development of modern psychology: association. We associate ideas together. We link images together. Images which occur together. My face occurs with my hands. You link the two. When you think of one, you think of the other. And above all, we link things, often in terms of cause and effect. Two things which go together, one following another. We associate them. We often assume that one causes the other. And this could be the origin of superstitions. Wrongly associating causes with effects. Look what I did. My action. Oh, my action. If we just associated that, you would think I was a genius. In my fingers, I have the power of light. Every time I do that with my fingers, light comes on. This is the cause of light. Well, no, that's a wrong association. My fingers are just agents which set in motion an electrical process. But it's easy for humans, without deep knowledge, to associate one thing with another and think they've got the cause. This is reflecting on two images, one as the cause of the other. Locke says reflection or association enables the possibility of both truth and error. We see the sun on the horizon, early in the morning, coming up. We associate it with light, and we say, oh, the sun rising in the sky causes light. And for centuries we've associated that. The sun's rising, moving towards the heavens, causes light. Well, after Galileo said, no, it's not quite like that. You've got the cause and effect. It's slightly misplaced. Now, what are some of the problems with Locke's theory? First of all, there's this assumption that perception comes first and is basically a passive, empty process. And it comes before active reflection, active working on what we see. Is this correct? Look at me. Now, think what you've all just done, or those of you attending. You turned your eyes to me, and then you saw me. That was an action, an active process. The perception of me then was not passive. You sought it out. And we attend to some things, not other things. And we can expect to see things. And when I said, look at me, you expected to see me as I looked just a couple of minutes ago. So that perception then was not purely passive, it was active. And that what Locke called reflection, and what a modern cognitive psychologist would call cognitive expectancy, can be part of the process of perception. Perception may not come first. And this would mean that Locke's idea of simple, clear, true ideas coming through perception may not be quite so simple. They may not be quite so pure or so true and objective. Okay, are you all with me so far? Right. And there's a bigger problem relating to Locke's model. That distinction he makes, saying ideas are either innate or come into the mind, and if they come into the mind, they must come from perception. It sounds so simple. It's like saying either things are innate or they're learnt, and in this case, they're learnt. But it misses out something crucial. Locke says, when you just go with Locke for a moment, the perception comes into the mind, pure, as it were, and then we reflect on it. Where does this ability to reflect on perception, to put perceptions together, to associate them, to compare what is now with what was just in the past, or just a moment ago, where does it come from? That ability to reflect, or we might say process information, deal with information, make it meaningful, hasn't come from perception itself. And if it hasn't come from perception itself, then it must be innate. And so Locke's argument is leading to the conclusion that maybe some of the abilities of the mind are innate. Or what modern psychologists would say, some tendencies in the way we process information are innate. You can't teach a newborn child how to recognise an object, how to combine its sensations so that it starts seeing faces. That these skills, you could say, can't be learnt. And if they can't be learnt, according to Locke's argument, they must be innate. That we must be born to think like humans and not like any other species. To deal with perceptions in a human manner. And there, if Locke is right in saying we come into the world with our minds empty, it doesn't mean saying just a blank sheet of paper isn't good enough. Because our minds are like machines which possess a particular structure, a particular potentials, and all they need is the fuel to be put into the fuel tank and someone to press the button and off they go. That's not a white blank piece of paper. That's like a machine ready to operate. For example, the infant and the face of the mother. It doesn't necessarily have to be the mother, it could be any carer. How does the infant come to recognise his face? Or how does the infant come to know that these different images, which it sees at different moments, all belong to the same face? Or more importantly, how does the infant come to think that the eye, the nose, the mouth, they form a whole, they form a face, they belong to the same object? And there is some modern research, which I'm not going to go into, but which does suggest that infants, from a very early time, combine these sights and sounds, not in a random way, but almost as if we're innately preordained to see faces, and see faces as objects. That we're born to recognise some patterns as objects, some patterns not as objects. The Gestalt psychologists in the 20th century argued this, and so certainly do modern cognitives such as Pilishin, an important figure in modern cognitive psychology. And therefore the mind isn't empty, not a blank sheet of paper at birth. It may not have contents, but it possesses what cognitive psychologists would call a cognitive architecture, a shape, a structure. Well, not really a shape, because we're dealing with something abstract. And that we could say the mind, it needs these sensations. Locke was right, it needs the sensations, it doesn't contain any memories or sensations. It needs the sensations to put its processes into operation. But these processes, the way it deals with the sensations, is not based on experience. It's there as the structure, the innate structure of our minds. So Locke saying something is either innate or it's acquired is too simple, because we're born maybe without ideas, but we're born with the potential for shaping our ideas once we start receiving sensations. And this suggests that Locke's contrast between learned and innate ideas is just too rigid. Are you with me? I shall go over anything else, because I know that a knowledge of Locke's theory is not innate. It has to be acquired, and acquired painfully. Now, what were Locke's achievements? Well, first of all, he looked in detail at the properties of the mind, much more detail than Hobbes, probably more detail than anyone else before, how we create knowledge. And someone can have an achievement, a brilliant achievement. It doesn't mean to say they're right in every way. And some of his ideas, some of his concepts have had absolutely lasting value. He used the metaphor of a storehouse for a memory store. That's still used. He formulated the principle of association and used the word association. That's still used as a technical psychological concept. And in so doing, he proposed what at the time was a revolutionary image of human beings. Seeing the world and seeing it properly. I hope you'll all look at the essay or the sections I put on the web. And it may come as a slight disappointment when you read Locke, because he's not a great writer. He can be rather turgid at times. It's not a striking text. And if you see the whole essay, it's hard to imagine anyone starting in the beginning and working their way right through it. It is a bit of a boring book, rather technical in places. And then you may ask yourself, well, didn't he say that He was scared to publish this work, at least until there was a change of government in Britain, until the Glorious Revolution. You can't imagine a boring work of cognitive psychology being banned, the author fearing that they may be thrown into prison or worse, they published it under their own name. So what was shocking about this theory of perception? Well, there were shocking things, which Locke didn't draw out. He was too cautious of them, but he knew others would see them. If you say the mind is empty at birth, what's going on? Oh, sorry, what happened?
I wanted to join your lecture, but it wasn't in this class.
You should have welcomed it in 9 months. If the mind is empty at birth, a white sheet of paper, this implies that at birth, the mind of everyone is the same. Whether you're the mightiest in the land, King James II or Charles II, or whether you're the lowliest peasant, you're born into the world with equal minds. There's no difference between the mind of a king and the commoner. At root, this is a very egalitarian theory of the mind. And Locke knew that. Locke knew that the aristocrats wouldn't like him. And there's another element. Remember, we're dealing with a very religious age. Locke, personally, was a very religious man. Not overly religious, but he believed in God. But he knew his theory really wasn't based on religion and had a non-religious element. And some of his critics came from the clergy and pointed this out. He is saying that knowledge comes from the senses, not from God. And what is we know to be the case are our ideas which correspond to what can be seen. And there are all these theologians every Sunday in England preaching the word of God is the truth. And Locke knew that no one, even the most devout, was not seeing God, was not seeing the miracles which the book they were reading and venerating was talking about. He knew that his theory, whether he liked it or not, and he didn't like this aspect of his theory, but he knew it, was pulling people away from a religious view of the world. He has a section in the book where he tries to say that by talking about faith, but he knows that in his own scheme, faith is second division compared with knowledge based on perception. And that his work, his theory of perception, implies that we cannot have a clear knowledge of God, metaphysical elements, because we can't see God, and because that belief in God is not based on perception, not based on a clear perception. And here we see something extraordinary in a way, and which wasn't deliberately planned. But psychology, or the analysis of the mind, has in itself a critical, an anti-religious, or non-religious element, regardless of the personal faith of the psychologists themselves. But if you say, I'm going to look at the mind and see how it works, you're setting yourself on a course for looking at the mind, as it were, as a machine, and not the mind as something created by a heavenly being. And I say this and I stress this in the case of Locke. It was not because Locke was non-religious. He was religious. But his ideas were taking him away from the religion which he trusted and believed in. It's not like Hobbes, who was probably anti-religious, based on the power of the ideas themselves. And what happens if you decide to be, and try to be, completely objective? Okay. You've got Locke part 1 and part 2. I'm going to talk about next week some of the critics, 2 of the critics of Locke. But to understand wait a moment, don't be in such a rush to get away from me. To understand the critics, you really have to understand Locke and what they're criticising. So, if there are elements which you haven't understood now, ask a question, come and see me, or send me an email. But I don't want any of you locked in confusion. I want you to look at Locke clearly and see a clear and true idea of this great, strange figure. Okay, off you go.